I never thought a family vacation could turn into a race for survival until my 12-year-old granddaughter looked at me with a face as pale as a ghost and whispered, "Grandpa, leave the liner." Now, we were standing in the middle of a crowded, glittering ballroom on the third night of our luxury Caribbean cruise, surrounded by music and laughter, yet the sheer terror in her eyes made my blood run cold. She didn't explain, she didn't argue. She just gripped my hand so hard her knuckles turned white and begged me to get off the ship while we were still docked at a remote island port. I had spent $15,000 on this trip to celebrate my retirement, and everyone in the family thought she was just having a panic attack, but something in my gut told me that if I didn't listen to her right that second, none of us would ever see home again. Was I absolutely insane for abandoning a luxury vacation and dragging my entire family into the middle of a dark, unknown island based on the word of a child? Or did I just save all of our lives from a disaster no one saw coming? You tell me if you would have ignored her, or if you would have trusted that instinct too, because what happened over the next 24 hours was a nightmare that still keeps me awake at night. It all started 6 months ago when I decided to do something big for my family. I'm a 65-year-old retired contractor, and after 40 years of laying bricks and managing sites, I finally had the nest egg I needed to give my kids and grandkids the experience of a lifetime. I booked the Royal Serenity, one of those massive, city-sized cruise ships with 16 decks, 10 restaurants, and enough neon lights to be seen from space. My son Mark, his wife Sarah, and their 2 kids, 14-year-old Leo and 12-year-old Maya, were beyond excited. Maya has always been a bit different. She's quiet, observant, and sometimes she says things that feel a bit too heavy for a kid her age. She's the kind of girl who notices a bird's broken wing from 50 yards away while everyone else is looking at the sunset. The first 2 days were perfect, or at least they seemed that way on the surface. We were eating 5-course meals, lounging by the infinity pools, and watching Broadway-style shows every night. But on the third morning, as we docked at a small, lush island called Isla del Toro, the atmosphere changed for Maya. She wouldn't eat her breakfast, and she kept staring out the porthole of our cabin with a look of intense concentration. I asked her what was wrong, and she just said the ship felt heavy, like it was tired. I laughed it off at the time, telling her it was just the sway of the ocean, but I noticed she started carrying a small notebook everywhere, scribbling things down while looking at the crew members. I saw her standing by the glass elevators, not looking at the view, but watching the way the doors rattled. She was counting the seconds between the flickers in the hallway lights. Most people would see a bored child, but I saw a girl who was analyzing a machine that was failing. She told me the air smelled like burnt pennies near the ventilation ducts on deck 4. I checked it myself and didn't smell a thing, but Maya's nose has always been sharp. By the time the afternoon sun began to set, the ship was preparing to depart for the next leg of the journey, which involved a long, 2-day stretch across open water. We were all dressed up for the captain's gala, feeling like royalty. As we walked through the main atrium, Maya suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She wasn't looking at the golden chandeliers or the champagne towers. She was staring at a service door that had been left slightly ajar. A man in a grease-stained jumpsuit slipped out, looking frantic, his radio crackling with static and voices that sounded like they were screaming. Maya didn't say a word to him, but she followed him with her eyes until he disappeared into an elevator. That was when she turned to me, her voice trembling but certain, and told me we had to leave. Mark and Sarah thought she was joking at first, then they got frustrated, telling her she was ruining the night. They pointed out that the ship was a marvel of modern engineering, and that we were in the middle of a dream vacation. But I saw her hands shaking. I saw the way she looked at the walls of the ship, as if they were made of glass about to shatter. She pulled me aside and showed me her notebook. It wasn't drawings, it was a log. She had recorded every time the lights had flickered, every strange vibration she felt in the floorboards, and the exact time she had seen senior officers looking worriedly at the lower decks. She told me she heard a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping that nobody else seemed to notice, and she said it sounded like a heart that was about to stop. She pointed out that the crew on this deck were wearing their emergency station pins, which wasn't standard for a gala night. The detail was so specific it made my skin crawl. The rest of the family was already heading toward the dining hall, but I stood there in the corridor, looking at my granddaughter. My logical brain told me to stay, to enjoy the lobster tail and the music, but my intuition, the same intuition that told me when a building foundation wasn't right back in my working days, was screaming at me to listen to her. I made a split-second decision that felt like madness. I told Mark and Sarah that we were getting off. A massive argument broke out right there in the hallway. Mark called me senile, Sarah was crying about the money wasted, and Leo was annoyed because he wanted to go to the teen lounge. I didn't care. I told them I'd pay for the flights home. I'd pay for everything. But we were taking our bags and getting off that ship before the gangway retracted. We barely made it. The crew looked at us like we were out of our minds as we scrambled to the exit just 10 minutes before departure. They tried to stop us, saying we'd forfeit our entire fare and be stranded without transport. One officer even tried to tell me I was overreacting to a minor technical check. But I saw the sweat on his forehead. We stood on the damp, humid pier of Isla del Toro, watching the Royal Serenity, this massive glowing mountain of steel, slowly pull away into the dark blue horizon. We were stranded on a tiny island with one small hotel and no plan. And my son wouldn't even look at me. He was so angry he just sat on a suitcase and hissed that I had destroyed the family's happiness for a child's whim. He spent an hour on the pier just staring at the receding lights of the ship, muttering about how I'd lost my mind and how he'd never let me plan a family event again. Sarah was frantically searching for flights on her phone, but there was nothing leaving the island until the next evening. We were stuck in paradise, and it felt like a prison. So there we were, standing on a dark pier, watching $15,000 and a dream vacation sail away into the night, while my own son looked at me with pure resentment. I had nothing but my granddaughter's feeling, and a notebook full of scribbles to justify why I had just stranded us in a foreign country. It was the loneliest I had ever felt in my life. Before I tell you what we discovered at 3 o'clock that morning, and the terrifying reality of what was happening on that ship, I want you to pause and be honest with me. If your grandchild or your child looked you in the eyes with that much genuine terror, would you have stayed on that beautiful ship? Or would you have walked away into the dark like I did? Drop a comment right now and tell me if you think I was being a protective hero or just a gullible old man, because the next part of the story changes everything. The silence on the pier was deafening once the ship's engines faded into the distance. We checked into a small, run-down guest house near the port. The rooms were hot, the air smelled like salt and old wood, and the tension in our family was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark stayed in his room, Sarah was on the phone trying to see if there was any way to get a refund, and Leo was sulking. Only Maya seemed calm. She sat by the window, watching the ocean. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was the sound of sirens coming from the Port Authority's building nearby. I walked out onto the balcony and saw lights flashing. I grabbed my phone and started refreshing the news, but there was nothing. Then I went down to the lobby where a small group of locals were gathered around a radio. Their faces were grim. I don't speak much Spanish, but I caught the name of the ship, Royal Serenity. My heart plummeted. I rushed back upstairs and pounded on Mark's door. We turned on the local news station in their room, and there it was, grainy footage from a Coast Guard helicopter. The ship wasn't sinking, not yet, but it was dead in the water, 30 miles out. A massive engine room explosion had ripped through the lower decks just 3 hours after leaving the port. Because the explosion had knocked out the primary and backup generators, the ship was in total darkness. But that wasn't the worst part. The fire was spreading, and the automated suppression systems had failed. We watched, horrified, as the news reported that the lifeboats on the port side were damaged and unusable due to the hull distortion from the blast. Thousands of people were trapped on the upper decks in the pitch black, with smoke billowing from the vents. The news anchor was describing a scene of absolute chaos. There were reports of a total power failure, meaning the electric davits for the remaining lifeboats weren't working properly. Crew members were having to hand crank the survival craft while the ship began to list slightly to the side. Maya walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the screen. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just looked relieved that we weren't there. For the next 12 hours, we watched the most harrowing rescue operation in modern history. Small fishing boats from the island and Coast Guard cutters from 3 different countries raced to the scene. It was a chaotic mess. People were jumping into the water in the dark, There were reports of crushes in the hallways as people tried to escape the smoke-filled cabins without any emergency lights to guide them. The heat from the fire had apparently made the floorboards in the midship section untouchable. I thought about our gala outfits, our polished shoes, and our champagne. All of it would have been useless as we fought for air in a dark, tilting corridor. As the sun rose, we learned that while most were being rescued, hundreds had been injured and several crew members who were in the engine room were missing. If we had been in our cabins, which were located right above the blast zone, we would have been trapped by the warped metal of the door frames. The very ballroom we were standing in when Maya begged me to leave had been the primary triage center, filled with smoke and screaming people. Mark eventually walked over to me, his face pale and his eyes red from crying. He didn't have to say anything. He just hugged me, and then he hugged Maya so tight I thought he'd never let go. He apologized over and over, his voice breaking as he realized that his anger could have been the last thing he ever felt toward me. The heavy feeling Maya had described was likely the sound of a failing stabilizer and a misfiring turbine that she had somehow sensed through the vibrations of the ship. Something the sensors had missed or the bridge had ignored to stay on schedule. We spent another 3 days on that island helping the survivors who were brought back to the shore. It was a sobering sight. People were walking off the rescue boats in their pajamas, some barefoot, all of them staring blankly ahead. I used my retirement money not for a luxury cruise, but to buy clothes, food, and supplies for the people who had lost everything in the fire. I saw a man who had been at our dinner table the night before. He had lost his wedding ring and all his luggage, but he was just shaking with gratitude to be on solid ground. The local church became a makeshift shelter, and my family, the same one that was fighting on the pier, was now working side by side to hand out water and blankets. The payoff wasn't the lobster or the fancy shows. It was the moment we stood on the tarmac of the island's tiny airport, waiting for our flight home, and we saw a family from the ship, a mother and 2 young kids, who had been in the cabin next to ours. They were covered in soot and looked traumatized, but they were alive. The mother recognized us and asked why we weren't on the ship when it happened. I just looked at Maya and said, "We had a better offer." We found out later through an official investigation that there had been 3 ignored warnings regarding the boiler pressure in the week leading up to our trip. The company had pushed the ship to finish one last grand gala circuit before scheduled maintenance. They gambled with 5,000 lives for a profit margin. Maya's notebook was actually requested by the maritime investigators. Her observations of the light flickers and the specific thumping helped them pinpoint the exact moment the secondary cooling system failed. This experience taught me that sometimes, the most important signals in the world aren't the ones on a dashboard or a computer screen. They're the ones we feel in our gut, and the ones our loved ones try to tell us if we're only brave enough to listen. Money can be replaced, vacations can be rebooked, but your family is irreplaceable. I'm just glad I chose to be insane that night. I look at my granddaughter now and I don't just see a quiet 12-year-old. I see a protector. We don't talk about the money anymore. We talk about the pier, the dark water, and the choice that gave us a second chance at life. If this story moved you, or made you think twice about your own instincts, please hit that like button to show you were on our side. It really helps the channel out. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these deep, personal dives into the stories that change us. What would you have done? Was I right to trust a 12-year-old over $1 billion ship? Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I'll see you all in the next story.